Hey, welcome back everybody. We're out in the Lumberyard today again for episode 2 of Lumberyard Lingo. We're going to talk today a little bit about the differences between dry and green lumber, 2x4, 2x6, nominal, net sizes, all kinds of stuff. We're standing in front of a unit of 2x12 dry Doug fir.
That's a great first term. Let's talk about green versus dry. Green lumber, obviously, we know has not been dried, which means that it's wet, right?
Yeah, when they actually mill green lumber, they cut the tree down, they mill it green, and it gets delivered to us green. That means it has not gone through a dryer or any sort of drying facility.
What would you say is the benefit to using dry lumber versus green lumber?
Well, a lot of the people that use green lumber like that it's a little bit cheaper, for one, and for two, it nails together a lot easier. But the biggest problem with it is that it's super heavy and you have to dry it before you can finish it. So if you frame a house with green lumber, you're not supposed to sheetrock it until it's below a certain moisture content. So if you're building a house out of dry, you've already skipped that step and it's ready to go as soon as you're done framing.
Even though it's a little harder to work with.
It is a little harder to work with. It does splinter and it does tend to crack when you nail it.
Let's talk about the difference in the drying process, or more pointedly, let's talk about the difference in the stamp. I noticed that some dry says KD and some dry says SD. I know that KD stands for kiln dried. What's SD stand for?
So SD stands for surface dry, or S dry. There's a big misconception about S dry is that it means it's surface dry only on the surface, but that is incorrect. It means that it was dried either in a kiln or by other means down to a certain moisture content and then surfaced. Surfaced dry.
And it's important to note that once lumber is dried, it does not take that moisture content back on again.
Right, it actually closes the cells in the wood fiber so it can't absorb moisture like it used to.
Sticking with what we saw stamped on the lumber, let's talk about some of the grading.
Yeah, all of your lumber is graded, and that's done by a person who's a lumber grader. And what they do is they look at the lumber, the grains, the heartwood, the knots that are in it, and they determine what grade that lumber is. So you'll see
its structurability.
Yeah, you'll see number 2, number 1, select struck. There's all kinds of different grades. In studs, you'll see things like stud grade, standard and better. Those are just different grades, and we'll get to that in a little more depth in a different video. But what we wanted to do is point out that on these lumber stamps, you'll see in the stamp what the grade is.
Most of the lumber we're talking about here is used for framing, in new construction, and in also remodel situation.
Exactly. There is one thing to keep in mind. When you're talking about lumber grades, Tony said something specific, and that is structure. All of the lumber that we have out here is graded for the structurability of that piece of wood, not for exposed. And what that means is if you're ordering a number 1 piece of wood, that doesn't necessarily mean that it looks nice. It means that it's super strong.
If you need to get something that's select for appearance, you'll have to state it that way.
Let's talk a little bit about how standard 2x lumber is sold. It's sold in mults or multiples of 2-foot increments, typically 8-foot through 28-foot. Lastly, we want to talk about dimension and length structure. All dimensional lumber comes in what's called net sizing. It's 2x4, 2x6, but the nominal dimension of that is different. A 2x4 is actually 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches. A 2x12 can be 1.5 inches by 11.25 if it's dry. So you've got to be careful when you ask for a 2x4 or 2x6. The reason for that is that back a long time ago, they would mill 2-inch by 4-inch lumber. And then they realized to make it all consistent, they would mill it down. So they cut a 2-foot or 2-inch by 4-inch piece of wood, and then they run it through the mill in planer to make it smooth and very consistent.
What you'll find most commonly in stock at a lumberyard are lengths in 2-foot multiples from 8 to 20. Also available, usually by special order, are lengths up to 28, 22, 24, 26, 28. But 8 through 20 is what you'll generally find on the ground in stock at most places where you're buying lumber. We know that's a lot of information to take in, but this will help you know what's available and what you need when you start your next project.
Yeah, especially when you come into the lumberyard, you're gonna wanna know what you're talking about.
Thank you so much for watching. This has been another episode of Your Weekend Warriors.
We'll see you next time.